So I want to first introduce our panelists tonight. First, we have Chris Everett, who is the producer and director of this incredible film. He's a native of Laurinburg, North Carolina. This is his first feature-length film, and I'm happy to say he's working on another, a follow-up. His background includes work in graphics and advertising and marketing, and we're thrilled that he's able to join us. We also have Reni Thomas. He's a native of Wilmington. He's a writer, a radio host, a lecturer, and an author. He's based in Chapel Hill now. His work he's worked at a bunch of radio stations, and he's writing as journalism has appeared in Downbeat, the New York Times Magazine. He wrote 2 books about the Wilmington 10 incident and also about this 1898 incident. And then we also are joined by LeRae Umfleet, she is the Chief of Collections Management at the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources. And LeRae is actually, she was a research historian at the research branch of the North Carolina Office of Archives and History. And I just want to mention that LeRae wrote, I'm going to put a link in later for this unbelievable book about this 1898 incident. And I'm going to put the link in later in the chat, and I can't recommend it highly enough. So when Chris was gracious to appear at our conference that we had back in October, and at that time we started talking about bringing him in to do a talk on, to participate in the panel on this film that he made. And since that time, we've seen what happened in Washington in January 6th, which made this film even that much more relevant. And I was sitting down to prepare for this, and I was thinking, okay, what are the ways that what happened in 1898 and what happened on January 6th, what are the similarities between those 2 incidents? So there were both attempts to basically overturn elections. They both involved manipulating the bureaucracy, and in Wilmington they had the commission where they packed the commission with 2 Democrats that allowed the aldermen to be replaced one by one, and allowed Waddell to be appointed mayor. In Washington, we saw the replacements that were made in the Pentagon and elsewhere after the election in the time leading up to January 6th, which were curious at the time. Misinformation, propaganda were involved in inciting the situation in both instances. There was a clear racist motivation, obviously, in Wilmington, but it should be as obvious in what happened in Washington. There were fascist gangs involved in both. We had the Red Shirts in Wilmington, we had the Proud Boys in Washington, and other paramilitary groups. And then I think for me, one of the things that really crystallized how similar they were was when I read in the foreword to the book that I just showed you. This is something that LeRae had written, and in describing the Wilmington incident as the coup, and I'm quoting now, not an isolated, spontaneous incident, but it was the result of a series of events that were directed and planned by upper class white businessmen in order to regain control of the government. So what am I missing, right? So I think it's kind of remarkable how closely these 2 incidents parallel each other. And so Chris, I just wanted to start with you and ask, first of all, why did you make this film? What brought you to this story?
Well, I would say what really made me want to do this was just the need to really get this story out here in a visual form. There were several books written by, about it already, but I thought that it needed some type of documentary perspective to it. And so that's what, made me want to do it. I was inspired by several other documentaries. One documentary in particular, Marco Williams' documentary from 2006 called Banished. And he deals with 3 racial massacres that happened down south, I think like in Georgia, and I think it's 2 in Georgia and 1 in Arkansas, where he documents 3 racial massacres that happened there. and also about the theft of property that happened there as well. And that really opened my eyes when I first saw it, like in 2010. I was like, man, this guy did a great job. Maybe it's time for someone to do something like that about the Wilmington Massacre and do it in this type of thing. So that really gave me the confidence to see someone do it. And I said, you know what, I want to make the attempt to do it. I'm not a Hollywood person by far. And it was like my first attempt at doing a film. So I was just able to just get people together. We were all new to this. Everyone that worked on the film, it was really everyone's first time making a feature-length documentary project. So we all looked at it as a challenge, but we all felt that same passion, really getting this story out there and telling it the best we can, and also getting folks involved like Larry and LeRae and others that you saw in the film, of bringing all these minds together and just to make one solid film. And that's what we wanted to do. And luckily that's what happened.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And actually, Larry was telling me earlier about the first time that you guys met, and that was actually when he recorded, when you filmed the poem at the end. Is that correct? Is that
yeah. The first if people have seen the film, the ending of the film of Larry doing the poem, that was the first actual scene we actually did. Originally, it was supposed to have been at the beginning, with everyone saying like a line from the poem.
Yeah.
But when you're doing a documentary, sometimes after you film the stuff and you start editing, it just doesn't make sense. So I said, you know what, it makes sense. It's perfect sense to have Larry end it. It's his poem. And I think it would make the perfect ending to close out the film, to kind of summarize, what the 1898 event was about, and also what the film was about. And it worked out perfect.
So, I do want to ask you a follow-up here right now, because one thing that I was wondering about was the opening of the film was the woman talking about reparations, right?
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about why you chose that as a way to start the film.
Well, I think that it's a topic that definitely needs to be in the mainstream, and the film has helped push it into the mainstream. But I know the descendants that I've dealt with and talked to, folks that Larry have reached out to and have worked with his organization, that's what they wanted. That's what they want: reparations, compensation. And I felt like it was right to set the tone up for that, so people know what they're getting into and see, the evidence of why reparations needs to be on the table for discussion. And really, it was really to set the tone. That's really what the overall message for me to put out there was about, the need for reparations, not only just for the Wilmington massacre, but African Americans in general, from slavery all the way up into the Jim Crow era. That's really what it's all about. Wilmington was just a small part of it, but specifically for Wilmington, the direct descendants, a lot of them have been wanting and seeking reparations. And I really wanted to help, deliver that. It's still a journey, but one day we'll get there.
So, Larry, you growing up in Wilmington, what was this incident, was this in the public sphere? Was this something that people talked about, that you knew about, or was it kind of kept hidden a little bit? I mean, I know you were telling me before about the getting at that book in the library.
Yeah, they talked about it in the whispers. It was like undercover. People didn't really know the specifics. They didn't really know the specifics until I wrote my thesis. And so I just disseminated to most of the folks in the area. That wasn't until 1980 that I completed my thesis, because I went all the way back to the beginning of Wilmington, 1660, and brought it up until the day that Ben Chavis came to town, February the 1st, 1971. And in the process of researching the Wilmington 10, you had to bump into 1898. That's why I say in the movie that the town is synonymous with racial violence, because there have been several events centered around race, violent events in Wilmington since its inception. It's a very bloody, bloody town, to say the least. The power structure does not hesitate to utilize violence in order to put the Negroes in their place. It was a very violent town.
So how do you think 1898 played into the Wilmington 10 situation?
They're directly related. I hate to give away my book and my thesis, but I make the contention that the Wilmington incident of 1971 was Black retaliation. I don't mean Black retaliation in the term, well, they were protecting themselves during the boycott at that church, but it became an effort where they were, just the mere fact that they boycotted the schools was retaliation from what happened. You have to understand that what happened, one of the results of 1898 was the psychological damage done to both Black and whites, because they got rid of the Black intelligentsia, they got rid of the role models. So what you had left was passive, docile, slave Black mentality that was that captured the minds of the local Africans. You have to understand, living in Wilmington, there's a clear dichotomy between the Black and the white people in Wilmington. And the generation that preceded these students who boycotted the schools was a very passive, scary type of vibe. It's still there, so it's a passive kind of vibe. So my thesis is that when the students boycotted, just the mere act of them boycotting the schools was the act of Black retaliation. In other words, they weren't going to act the way that their grandparents and their parents were acting. So that's how they're related, as far as I'm concerned, just by living there and experiencing that. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. So LeRae, I wanted to, your book just lays out the whole context, historical context for everything that happened in such exquisite detail. And I wanted to know if you might just speak a little bit about how Reconstruction kind of set the stage for what happened in 1898.
So first things first, we have Democrats and Republicans in 1898 and 1870 and throughout this time period. But we have to understand that Democrats and Republicans of the late 19th century are not Democrats and Republicans of 2021. The Democrats at that time period were mostly Confederate veterans, conservative whites, white supremacists, and largely farmers. And then you have the Republican Party, and I'm speaking in broad general terms here. I could talk for hours about all of this, but I'm trying to narrow it down because everybody doesn't want to be here all night. And the Republican Party is the party of Abraham Lincoln. The African-American voters were most often Republican. In North Carolina, you also have a white contingent of Republicans who are some native North Carolinians who were progressive, and also Northerners who had moved into North Carolina after the Civil War who were businessmen. And so under Reconstruction, we have this trying to figure out how we become a state and how we work ourselves back into this new nation. And Reconstruction ended in around 1877, and the Republicans pretty much faded into the background of running the state of North Carolina. And by 1896, we have this new approach to how the political parties are operating in North Carolina with this thing called fusion. And the Republicans were a minority, and they knew that they needed to find a way to meet in the middle with some disaffected Democrats who became what they called populists, as a third party. And so third party politics came into play, and populists and Republicans fused their vote in 1896 to defeat the Democratic hold that had been on state government since the end of Reconstruction. And throughout this whole time period, African Americans in Wilmington particularly had been becoming entrepreneurial. They were buying homes, they were becoming well educated, and Wilmington was becoming that type of city that the New South at the turn of the 20th century could become. And in the 1898 6 election, the Democrats lost control of both the governor's office and the state legislature. And that set the stage for what happened in 1898 with the political party of the Democrats going, we have to regain control of the state of North Carolina, and we have to figure out how to do that. And so they successfully manipulated the white supremacy platform in 1898 based on their losses from 1896. So that's in a nutshell how we moved from Reconstruction and figuring out how we're going to become a state with equal rights for African Americans and whites. And there was a push and pull, and there's always push and pull in our history where African Americans are able to grab at what the American dream is, and then people like these white supremacists push back at it, and they lose some of that newfound freedom they have, and then there's a push and a pull. So we're seeing this push and pull in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And the push was very hard in 1898 to push African Americans from what they could have had in this wonderful new city that they were building alongside whites to second-class citizen status that lasted until the Civil Rights Movement.
So was this fusion political alliance, was this restricted to, was this unique to Wilmington and New Hanover County, or was this a phenomenon elsewhere as well?
Well, this was a statewide sort of thing, and there was a national sort of approach at this type of thing too, but North Carolina did it better than some places with this fusionist attempt at running the government. And this was an uneasy alliance between the Republicans and the populists, because the populists were all white farmers who were disaffected with the Democratic Party for the most part, and they wanted what they wanted, and the Republican African-American white coalition that were Republicans wanted what they wanted, and they didn't always get everything they wanted. So it was a very tenuous coalition, and the Democratic white supremacy campaign of 1898 found the weaknesses and broke that apart.
And so the Democrats actually won a lot of offices, did they not, in 1898? I mean, so how did they get from that to November 10th? What happened between Election Day and November 10th?
So the Democratic Party had a long-range plan for 1898 and 1900. And the 1898 elections in North Carolina were to seat people in the state legislature. And then the 1900 election would be to seat the governor. And the plan was to retake control of the state legislature in 1898 for the white supremacy platform, and rewrite all of the egalitarian laws that the fusionist government had put in place beginning in 1896 to make it much harder for African Americans to vote, to return power back to that upper class white ruling elite. And so they had to take 1898 election to regain control of the state legislature, and then the 1900 election would be the one that they would seek to take control of the governor's office. And being this time period that we're in, they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have Facebook, and so the campaign made use of a three-prong attack, which is newspapers, stump speakers who traveled around and spoke to various communities, and the red shirts, which were a militant arm of the Democratic Party. They were the KKK without hoods in broad daylight. And so this tripartite attack on the election season of 1898 meant that the white supremacy platform was spewed across every town in North Carolina, and Wilmington was the focus of the campaign because it was the largest city in North Carolina. It had a African American white coalition running the city government, and it was 50-50 African American white in the population. And so the Democratic leadership felt if they could make Wilmington the flashpoint for the statewide campaign, and they could take Wilmington, they could take the rest of the state. And so that's how it worked out.
So Chris, you grew up in a different part of the state. What was your sense of this, and what did you in researching this and creating this film, what did you learn that surprised you, if anything? Or
Right. Well, I think the biggest thing that surprised me was, just like LeRae was saying, that this was a statewide movement of white supremacy. And doing, research and looking into Larry's book and LeRae's book, and just doing my own research with old archival newspapers, I saw that, you know, Laurinburg played a big part of it as well. A lot of the red shirts, like any pictures that you see of red shirts, you know, whether it's on the internet or from the state archives, is red shirts from Laurinburg or based in Laurinburg. And so I was like, wow, that's where I'm from. So it's kind of weird that African American from Laurinburg ends up making a documentary about, you know, Wilmington, you know, the Wilmington Massacre. I found it now that, and I didn't realize that until after I finished it. That I guess, you know, everything comes full circle, I guess. But yeah, I think that was one of the biggest surprises. Just, I guess, how big this was. It just wasn't restricted to Wilmington. This was a whole statewide movement of white supremacy, and they kind of targeted Wilmington because it was the largest city at the time. And also just the different layers of this whole organized coup. And again, like you were saying earlier, it wasn't spontaneous. You know, this is very calculated. So I think those were the two things that really shocked me, was the calculation, the planning, and also how big this thing actually was. Those were really the two things. And say the third thing was the families, especially from the African American side of things, of them, you know, a lot of them not really finding out, you know, what happened, you know, to their grandparents or great grandparents until later on in life, about, you know, those stories being suppressed, you know, over these years. And those were the things that really stuck out to me while making this project.
Yeah, I want to just also give a nod to Jeff Spokes, who pointed out correctly that another parallel that we were talking about before was that was the replacement of the judges. That we've seen that, we saw that in Wilmington, and we certainly saw it in the last 4 years. Larry, what do you think? How has the attention that this incident, this move, has gained in the last few years? How do you think how has that been received in the state? How are people understanding all of this now compared to when you were growing up?
Well, an interesting thing about the whole thing is that because of I-40, Interstate 40 East, a lot of different people are moving into Wilmington who hadn't lived there before, because if you've ever been there, it's a paradise, surrounded by water, and it's on the tip of the northern Gulf Stream. So the weather is always ideal. It never gets really cold there. So the population has swelled. And what has happened, you've found people who are moving in there and they said, well, this is a nice place, but there's something wrong. We can't put our finger on it, but there's just something wrong with this place. And when Chris came out with the movie, the first time we showed the movie, the people were lined up. I mean, it was an overflow crowd. And most of the people who were lined up, they were people who had moved there from someplace else. So they were really interested in finding out the history of Wilmington. So I think, to answer your question, I think the whole vibe has changed. The whole town has changed. At least the attitude has changed of the town as a result of this movie. And they want to find out more about how can they move forward? How can they change the conditions? How can they change the mentality of the town? You have to understand that it was a secret, but the secret is there is no secret. This incident is well documented. That's why LeRae was able to find so much information. That's why Chris was able to find so much information. When I was in grad school doing research on the Wilmington 10 and doing research on 1898, there was a girl there from Japan who was working on her thesis. And her thesis is out now. It's been out for several years. There was also a gentleman there from Germany who I met. And my advisor introduced me to this gentleman. And he kept looking me up and down. He said, "You're from Wilmington?" I said, "Yeah." I guess he wanted to see if I was in good shape. Did I survive Wilmington? Right. So this thing is well documented. And once you start bringing out all this information, the people who are seeing this research, they say, well, how could this happen and we not know about it? And the founding fathers had really fought I-40. They didn't want I-40 coming into Wilmington because that would bring new blood in there. So when Chris came out with this movie and we came out with all this research, they were flabbergasted because they didn't know the full extent of what happened in Wilmington. It was cold-blooded robbery, cold-blooded thievery, and cold-blooded murder.
We're pretty good at denial in this country, I think.
Yes, yes, but you can't deny that this didn't happen.
Right.
And, you can't deny that the result was devastation for the black community and for the white community. And the same thing happened the other day with the Trump crowd, just like you mentioned earlier. The quote unquote elite, I wouldn't call Trump an elite, but the people, the upper class. And if you read this book called The Wilmington Rebellion of 1898, written by Harry Hayden, he cites the Secret Nine. And these are the same people who are in control in Wilmington now. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They used the poor whites, the same thing that happened in Congress the other day. They used the poor whites, whipped them into a frenzy, told them that these African Americans were taking over their town. You have to understand you had a very strong African American community, very strong. So strong, legend has it that you had some African Americans in Wilmington who were so well off that they had white butlers and white maids. So the whole thing had to be reversed. And so they whipped these poor whites into a frenzy. The same thing happened in 1971 with the Wilmington 10. Poor whites were circling the church that the children were meeting in, shooting at the children who were meeting in the church. So it's not that same dynamics takes place all the time. The elite, quote unquote elite, whipped the poor whites and the not so poor whites into a frenzy in order to take over, in order to regain their power. So that's what Wilmington is dealing with, and that's what the new people, the new blood that is moving into Wilmington is trying to figure out how to compensate for that loss, for that psychological loss, for that economic loss, for that political loss. So that's what people are working on in Wilmington now. I don't live in Wilmington. I live in Chapel Hill on purpose because you could feel that vibe there. I mean, the vibe is still there. What happened when I did my thesis, I disseminated to a lot of folks. One of the people that I disseminated to was Senator Luther Jordan, who went before the General Assembly and said, well, let's at least study this. And that's how LeRae was able to do her study, because Luther, and took a lot of balls in to do that, said, well, let's at least study it, because nobody had studied it. So once they studied it and looked at it, when the General Assembly issued this report that LeRae had written, and that's when the cat was out. One of the members in the General Assembly, a Republican, said, oh, the cat is out of the bag. But I think it was more like the tiger's out of the bag. And the tiger's been out of the bag since then. I think it's wonderful. I'm having a ball.
So LeRae, how was it received, LeRae? How did things, how was the report received?
Well, I've been traveling. I'm not from Wilmington either, but I traveled to Wilmington quite a bit to do the research, to talk to folks, to learn more about how the community reacted and the climate that was there while I was doing the research, and secretly hoping that folks had letters and diaries in grandma's attic that they would share that might give us some more details. And in the process of this, I was doing informational talks around Wilmington, and it's a basic talk of this is what Wilmington was like, and this is the political campaign that led up to the violence, and this is what happened with the coup d'etat, and this is the tragic loss of life piece of the puzzle. And the audience, there's all kinds of people in the audiences when I would do those things, 2003, 4, 5, and they were, new people, like Larry said, that moved into this wonderful paradise of a place, descendants of those rabble rousers who probably pulled the triggers on November 10th. There were all kinds of people in these talks, and there was an element of the population that would come. They would heckle me, they would argue with me, and try to pretty much bury my voice in the presentation I was giving on behalf of the state on this project. But the saving grace for me was that the largest majority of people who went to these talks were people like the people who are attending tonight, who simply wanted to learn more, who wanted to understand. And also because of what Larry said, the narrative of what happened in Wilmington isn't unknown, it was just hidden and buried in our classroom textbooks in North Carolina history. And it wasn't taught in our high schools, in our middle schools, or even in college up until recently. And I say recently, in the last 20 years. So it's been a quiet growth of the knowledge of 1898 and the violence and the causes and effects. And for the most part, folks in Wilmington want to hear, they want to learn, and they are amazed that such a horrible thing happened in their city. And, you know, there are elements in the African American community, folks I've met, folks I've, you know, I send Christmas cards to every year now because there's some really wonderful people in Wilmington. They didn't know they had ancestors who died on November 10th, 1898. And it was a shock that that story of such a tragic thing in their family's history had been buried so deeply that they didn't even know it. So there's the spectrum of people who are appalled, amazed, want to keep it quiet. You know, I've been told I was, you know, why is this good little Southern girl stirring up such bad history? And it needs to be known, it needs to be told, and it needs to be understood. So, yeah.
What about the state? Has the state, since the report, did the state react in any way that suggests they're taking responsibility in some way?
Well,
no, I mean, it's a question.
Larry. So the commission to study the 1898 Wilmington race riot was created by Senator Jordan, and it was in effect until 2005, when the report that I wrote alongside of the commission's recommendations for dealing with the effects of 1898 were presented to the state legislature. And the state legislature received it, and they went, wow, that's a good report. And many of the recommendations were put into committees, and then they died into committees. There was never any action on many of the recommendations of the commission. There was an apology issued by the legislature where they apologized for their inability in 1898 to protect the lives and property of its citizens in Wilmington. And the Democratic Party issued an apology too, even though the Democrats of 2006 weren't the Democrats of 1898, still the same party though. And so those have been the two big things. One of the major push points for the commission's work was to get the story of 1898 more widely available to the citizens of the state. And so publishing the report in the book format was one approach to solving that desire. And we wanted the curriculum in the school system to be adapted to include 1898. And that's been done to varying degrees of success. It's been more about teaching teachers how to teach the difficult history that we have to present in this story, more so than it being a clear point in a curriculum.
So I just want to ask one thing based on what you just said. What were like the top line recommendations that were ignored? In your opinion, what were the most important recommendations?
Well, you know, I have them here because I always, and it's all messed up and flagged and stuff, but we touched on this a little bit. There was a large African-American entrepreneurial endeavor in Wilmington. And Wilmington was the place where if you wanted to start a business, you could start a business if you were African-American. Your business was going to make money, and your business was going to be in the main thoroughfare right alongside white businesses. And then you had more ability to buy a house. Your educational system was going to be better for your children. So Wilmington was this, you know, shining city on a hill kind of thing at the beginning of the 1890s. And 1898 ended it. Business leaders were pushed out of town. Civic leaders pushed out of town, told never to come back. Good number of men were killed, and families were separated forever. And that entrepreneurial spirit died. And so one of the focus points of the commission was to try to help bring back that entrepreneurial effort in the city with, startup way of helping people get their businesses going. I think there are different entities in Wilmington now trying to do that in a grassroots sort of way, but there wasn't ever anything done by the state.
Yeah. One of the, Chris, one of the real, one of the tragic elements, it's all tragic, but one that you brought out in the film was the population loss, right? I mean, there was the exile of all those people and just, looking at the statistics in the book of what happened to the population right after that. I'm wondering, has there been any effort or do you know of any movement for people who were displaced to actually return, or is that too painful?
No, you're right. The population was decimated not only, right after the massacre, but years after. You got to realize, Jim Crow was in full effect, right after that. And, a lot of folks left Wilmington. Quite a few folks went to Durham because around that time they were getting their whole Black Wall Street movement going on the Parish Street district, and they were doing their thing. And you saw several folks from Wilmington leave and go there. To start over, you had some folks go to New Jersey, to Cape May County, with George Henry White helped establish a town there called Whitesboro. And you had people go to Philadelphia, New York, Norfolk, other port places as well, because, those were the cities to be at back those days, were your port towns. And so you saw that. But, years later, you saw folks kind of returning, to visit family, the late 40s, 50s. I've talked to people from Whitesboro, and some of them, a lot of them know their whole lineage with their family, from Wilmington, and still come down to this day, and doing those type of things. But another thing that really caught me was, again, what we were saying earlier about people that didn't know they had families from Wilmington, and then they saw the film. People hit me up all the time on social media or through my email and said, "Man, I saw your film, and I actually have family that was from Wilmington, and they ended up leaving like 1899, or 1900, and I never knew why, and this kind of is tying in some things." So you find that a lot, in our history as Black people here in America, that, once we left these places, we never really talked about it, one, because of fear. And you got to realize this was a time where we didn't really have rights. So no one was really going to hear, our pain and struggles, or our grievances. So we just had to move on and do what we had to do.
One of the things that I thought you brought out so beautifully in the film was this sense among the Black community, at least, of this loss of potential. This prosperity that could have been theirs. Is that something that was shared by white people down there? Do they have that same recognition?
I think now they do. It's like, I think the city as a whole now really recognizes, after watching the film and reading all the books over the years, the city as a whole, even the white population, see that this massacre, and I know LeRae talks about this in the film, that it really stunted the whole potential of the city. It just didn't affect, the Black population, it stunted the whole city. And there's no telling what the city of Wilmington could have been if this never happened. So I think they're finally seeing that now, especially when you watch the film and see, like, man, our city had the potential to be a major city in the United States.
Larry, do you concur with that? What's your sense of how people understand the lost opportunity there?
Well, I think the ones who, like I mentioned earlier, I think the ones who just moved there from other places, you have to understand that the population really expanded, and understand there's over 250,000 people living there, the people living across the river over in Brunswick County. But like I said before, I don't really know what's happening. What happened? I don't really know what's happening there, because like I go to visit my mom, but I get the impression from just people who I see attending the movie, because we've shown the movie down there several times. I get the impression that the people who are moving there from other places want to help, but the people who have been there before they could care less. And they really resent the fact that the movie is shining some kind of spotlight on the tragedy. You know, because like I said before, it was supposed to have been a secret. But because of the movie, and I don't want to be self-serving, but because of what I did, I actually went in the African American community and I disseminated I used to run a bookstore down there, you know, and I would have book signings. So I think the African American community is looking for something to happen. But when I go down, I don't get the impression that anything has happened. I don't see any change. Maybe Chris does. I think that's what he's trying to bring out in Wilmington on Fire #2. But like I said before, you got rid of the Black intelligentsia in 1890. I mean, they put these people on a train and ran them out of town. So what? You don't have anything to work with. You understand? So this is what happened. You know, I ran a bookstore for almost a year and a half. And initially I got good business from the middle class African American community, but after a while, you know, that kind of, what you have down there in the African American community is what, you know, you're from Maryland, you know about crabs. When these crabs get in a barrel, they bring each other down. And this is what's happening in Wilmington in the African American community. I don't see any improvement. Maybe Chris does, or maybe somebody who's not from Wilmington can see that. But I don't see anything happening, any kind of progress. I see people wanting, especially the people, like I said before, who moved there from somewhere else. They wanted to work, but you know, I don't see any, man. Maybe because when I go down there, we have a cottage on Tulsa Beach. I go to Tulsa Beach. I don't even go to Wilmington because I can still feel that vibe because I know the true story, you know. And sometimes in November on a cold, misty night, you can hear these people crying out for help. You know, I hate to sound spooky, but you can hear these spirits because you have to understand what happened. They just went around just slaughtering people and left the bodies in the street for weeks. And the buzzards were circling the town. That's what I wanted to call. I wanted to call the movie Buzzards in Wilmington, but Chris said, no, let's call it Wilmington on Fire. It was a serious tragedy, and it has had profound negative effect upon the psychological makeup of the African Americans in Wilmington. And it's going to take another 100 years before it take care of itself. That's why I created an organization. My organization is seeking compensation for the victims, for the descendants. And we found two people. We found Manley and we found Thomas C. Miller's family. And I think if you make that move to compensate, the community needs to be compensated. Not only does Manley and Thomas C. Miller's family needs to be compensated, but I think the community needs to be compensated. And that's how you solve this problem. You don't solve this problem by sitting around holding hands, kumbaya. Yeah, that's not going to work. From what I see, you know, one of the reasons I got involved in the movie with Chris was I've had several people to come to me and want to do a movie on the 1898 massacre. But Chris, we had an understanding that it had to be told from the African American perspective. It has to be told from the perspective of the victims. That's what this movie is about. It's not a history lesson because it's been well documented. I mean, if you Google it, you can find out all about it. Even before LeRae did her piece, you could have found a whole lot of information on it. My pieces came out in 1980. I found a whole lot of information on it. So I hope I answered your question. Yeah. I get kind of carried away sometimes because I'm a native.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Chris, from your point of view, what kind of effect has the movie had in terms of encouraging or at least opening the conversation about reparations and compensation? And you know, I'm thinking also of the point that was made by I can't remember his name towards the end about it can't be money, right? It's got to be. He's talking about that.
Right. Well, it's been a lot of positives with the film being out. I would say one, a couple of summers ago, when they had the big congressional hearing on reparations in DC, Dr. Julianne Malveaux, who's been a supporter of the film and researching its history, you know, she gave the film a huge shout out right there at Congress and urged people to watch Wilmington on Fire. And she was, you know, talking about the 1898 massacre and its role in a lot of this stuff. And so that right there, you know, shows that the film is reaching, you know, on those levels, even though it's been through a grassroots effort. You know, the film is getting out there, and also just it's had its effect on the city of Wilmington. And that's why I wanted to make a follow-up, you know, to this, because a lot of the folks that we've been filming that are really trying to make a difference in the city of Wilmington, they all say, man, when I saw your film, it really changed my life and made me want to do something different for this city. One guy in particular, he co-founded this big tech company in Wilmington several years ago. And he saw my film and he reached out. He said, man, your film really woke me up and really showed me, you know, what's really going on. And I want to do more to get involved. And he's been doing that over the past several years of helping, you know, helping Black entrepreneurs, you know, start businesses, doing all type of stuff. And, you know, we filmed one of his interview the other day while filming part 2. And he was like, you know, reparations is definitely owed, but until the government does that, it's up to the white business community in Wilmington to do something. And, you know, he said that right on camera, and he's been really doing it and has been trying to urge other major business owners in the city to do the same thing. It's a struggle, you know, says, but he's really trying to lead by example, and I commend him for that. And those are some of the things, or other people who have started movements and organizations, you know, talk about the film all the time. So I didn't realize the power of the film and what it was going to do. I was just a guy from Laurinburg that was just trying to make the film the best that I could, and whatever happens, happens. But I didn't realize that it really sparked a real change in the city. The Wilmington Police Department, they're using it now to train their new recruits. There's been several corporations now that require, you know, new hires to watch the film, and they're actually having classes on it now. So those things are happening, you know, and even in the schools in Wilmington now, they're starting to kind of integrate the film and more about the 1898 history into their curriculums. And so those things are happening, you know, on a small level, you know, small and slow, but it's getting there. And, you know, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make part 2, to really, you know, highlight that. And because Wilmington is like my second home. You know, I met my wife here while filming Wilmington on Fire. And, you know, I'm here all the time and met some great people here. And, you know, I just want to do what I can do, you know, to make this city, you know, better for everyone.
So, you know, change is insidious, right? So it's hard to imagine 5 years ago that even a conversation about reparations would be on the table. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. That thing happens. But let me ask you, what is part 2 going to be?
You said, when is it, or what is it?
What's going to be? What is it going to be about? What is it going to take?
Oh, it's pretty much, you know, part 1 is all the history. Part 2 is very different. It's more of an observational verite style, and it's really focusing on Wilmington today. And also it ties into a lot of the current events, you know, the stuff that happened January 6th in DC, the recent elections in November, the protests that, you know, happened out of, you know, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. There was a lot of activity in Wilmington during that time, and we were there to document all that. So it's showing how Wilmington, even when all these things have happened, these national events, people still refer to Wilmington, and it goes back there every time, whether the protests were going on with the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, what happened January 6th, even with the recent elections. The Washington Post did a big story about the upcoming election, and they came to Wilmington interviewing folks. And so even with these national events, Wilmington is still the main focus, you know, over 120 years later. And that's what it's really about, showing that, and also showing the community, you know, what they're really trying to do to really get Wilmington out of this dark past.
You know, this year we're also observing the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre.
Right.
There's a lot of been talk about the Greenwood. And do you think, from your perspective as having documented this, do you consider this an isolated incident, or do you think this is?
Oh no, that's not isolated at all. You know, there were massacres before the 1898 event, and there were more after. You know, even we've had coup d'états before, throughout the country, but I think this one is significant. Because it really ushered in, I guess, full-on white supremacy and led to a different type of model of white supremacy, where other places, followed afterwards. But yeah, this wasn't just a singular event. This stuff happened all the time. Like almost every year, you see like a short documentary or somebody writing a book about an uncovered racial massacre or ethnic cleansing in a certain place, in America, that happened to Black people there. So no, we're finding out new things like this happen, hundreds and thousands of times.
Having this history yourself of documenting this and learning these lessons, were you surprised at what happened on January 6th?
Oh no, not at all, not at all. One of the reasons is because even I think like a couple months, I think right after the elections in November happened, I was invited to a podcast, a radio show, and we were having that discussion that something like this was probably going to happen. So a lot of people were already kind of predicting that. Even the talk was kind of happening on social media. A lot of these folks that ended up participating doing this stuff were actually talking about doing it, just like in Wilmington, of the talks of something like this possibly happening. And again, the government doesn't do anything about it, and I think that's what the similarities are. And also the government didn't really punish anyone either, just like in 1898. And I think that's my biggest takeaway is the after effect of there's no punishment. If no one's held accountable, it's just going to happen again. And that's what leads me to believe that something else can happen still, even after January 6th, because no one's been held accountable and no one's been punished.
One thing that struck me is that after 1898, the state laws were being created to eliminate Black participation in voting, and we're seeing that actually right now again. All of this spate of laws all over the place. LeRae, what do you think is the for you? What are the really important lessons that we should carry from what happened in 1898 moving forward?
That for me, oh gosh, there's so many lessons. That political propaganda, and we saw this in our recent election season, political propaganda meant to push forward a political party, a perspective, ideology, can turn into murder in the streets. The people in Wilmington lost their lives, their livelihood, and everything that Wilmington could be for them because of a political campaign that was rooted in white supremacy and that was intended to keep a small minority of upper class ruling elites in power. And we would like to think that that wouldn't happen again, but we need to be vigilant, and we all need to do our part as citizens of the United States to make sure that every citizen has free and open access to what our Constitution and Declaration gives us. And so that when I got into studying what happened, that politics can lead to murder was just something that astounded me. And unfortunately, we've seen it again, and so we need to do all we can to prevent that.
Larry, how about you? What do you think what would you want people to carry from this, learning about this experience? What's the most important thing you would like people to understand?
African excellence. I mean, look at these people from 1865 to 1898. These people had attained economic status, political status, and social status. African excellence. A good friend of mine was Dr. John Hope Franklin, and we would have conversations about this event. In his book, From Slavery to Freedom, he mentions it. He has a short paragraph. But he said, you know, Larry, they just couldn't stand it. He mean the people who were in control. He said they just couldn't stand the sight of seeing Africans prosper. You know what he said? He said they had to cut them down to size. So this is what happens when in other words, if you give the African an inch, he'll take a yard. There's an excellent book you need to read also. You need to put, if you want to, this is the definitive history of the 1898 incident. It's called We Have Taken a City by Leon Prather, who was a professor, a history professor at Tennessee State University. He was researching something else, and he bumped into 1898. And he said, Thomas, we brought him to town. I brought him to town. Our organization brought him to town. He said, Thomas, the whole thing was about economics. The race was used as a smokescreen to cover up the economic aspect of it. He said he used to speak in riddles. Incidentally, he was a jazz musician. He played with the Jimmy Lunceford Band, but he got tired of starving, so he went back to school and got his doctorate. And he said, you know what, Thomas? He said you could put a black man in a suit. That's why you have black men who are butlers and they're chauffeurs and they're bellhops. He said they look like $1 million. He said, but you can't say the same thing about a poor white man. He said you can put him in a suit, but he will not look the same. But his point was that if you give the African, look at Thomas C. Miller. Thomas C. Miller was a very rich man. He was able to loan money to white and black people. But you know they wanted to run him out of town. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that if you give the black man an inch, he'll take a yard. And this is what the power structure wants you to never see happen. For this, look at Obama. They don't never want you to see the black man looking good. Like John Hope Franklin said, they'll cut him down to size. So African excellence, period, is what I see out of this whole episode. I don't see all the other funny stuff. So if you give us a chance, we can do whatever we want to do, but we haven't been given the chance. Every time we try to do something, somebody wants to cut us down to size.
So Quint Gregory here asked a relevant question. He asked if UNC Wilmington are they addressing this in any way, offering tuition to descendants of the
I doubt it.
No, no. I think UNCW, they're trying to do some things, but they're not doing that. We haven't got that far yet. But they are teaching it. They're doing things like that of implementing and doing things. I know one thing they're working on is to I know a lot of colleges have this, even where we're at Duke University in Durham, and other colleges, they have like I forgot what they call it. It's like for like freshmen that come in, and it's like a required film they have to watch. Yeah, kind of like a film they're required, and they're working on making Wilmington on Fire, one of those films. So they're taking those small steps, man. It's not, we didn't get here, in a week. So it's going to take a while, especially in Wilmington. Just all the stuff we were talking about, the city is still dealing with a lot of that. And even though you have new blood there, new energy, there's still that old blood and old energy that's still there. And it's going to take a while to overcome that. But, we got to keep pushing.
Yeah. LeRae, I wanted to ask you a question actually earlier and I forgot, but it was an incident where there was an ultimatum that was given to deliver a response, I guess to Waddell, the colored conference, the colored
Committee of Colored Citizens.
Yes, exactly. And it was suggested that a response was delivered, but we never found out. But Waddell did not communicate that, did he? I mean, what was that? You remember that?
So on just a quick, November 8th was the election. Democrats won every position they had a candidate up for. The city elections were not part of that election season. The city elections weren't until March of 1899. On November 9th, the white leadership in the city came together and said, we're not going to tolerate having African Americans run our city. We just won the state with the Democratic White Supremacy campaign, and we're setting out a series of demands to the Black community of Wilmington. and they created what they called the White Declaration of Independence. And the preamble was, "We, the citizens of Wilmington, shall no longer be ruled by men of African origin." And then they set out a list of demands. And those demands were given to a group of the white leadership chose a group of African American citizens representing the community. That was called the Committee of Colored Citizens. They were given these demands and told to have a response to Waddell by a certain time the next morning on the 10th. And the answer was written down on a piece of paper and given to a young man, a young attorney, to deliver to Waddell. But Wilmington was an armed camp. There were armed men roving the streets, and especially in the white community, there were people at every street corner, and Waddell's house was in the white community. And this young African-American attorney was being scuffed up all the way around, beaten up. He was fearing for his life. He didn't think he would make it. So he put the response in the mail to be taken to Waddell by the time the next morning. However, there's a lot of disconnect, but we believe Waddell knew what the response was going to be, and he chose not to acknowledge that he knew what that response was going to be. And but the demands were so onerous that the folks in the African American community couldn't really meet those demands in the first place. They wanted to do everything they could to keep the peace, but the charge had already been set, the dynamite was in place, and the spark happened on the morning of November 10th, and it was going to happen one way or the other. So, yeah.
Then I just want to, one last thing was just to find out, we were talking before about the response of the North Carolina government and establishment, but what about the local government in Wilmington?
It's more that push and pull sort of thing. And Chris is more, he's got his finger on the pulse a little bit more than I do in Wilmington, but there has been some response to the renaming of things, taking down of monuments that we saw as a result of the George Floyd protests and Breonna Taylor activities. But Wilmington is, there's little places where you do see it coming to grips with what happened, and then there's other places where you don't. I'm a historic preservationist. I want to see the landscape, the history of Wilmington preserved in a physical sort of way. And there's some places in the heart of the Black community where people were murdered that I would like to see preserved for perpetuity. We've got historic houses and monuments all over the city of Wilmington to the white folks. We need some for the African American community. So I've been pushing with people I know to try to acquire some of these spaces and places to commemorate, memorialize, monumentalize. We've already got a great monument to 1898 in downtown as it is, but we need more, in my opinion.
Chris, what's your sense of that? How the locals are?
Yeah, it's been, like I said, last year, with the murder of George Floyd, you saw several, monuments getting, Confederate monuments get taken down. I don't think they did them to do the right thing. It was pressure coming on them because they were, a lot of people talking about vandalizing them. So they just went ahead and took them down out of that response. It wasn't because they wanted to do the right thing, but you saw places like Hugh McCrae Park. They finally changed the name to that, to Longleaf Park. So you saw those type of things happening. I think one elementary school, they changed the name for that as well. So you have those type of things going on. But I know when was it? Last year as well, where they were able to put up a Black Lives Matter art mural. It was a lot of pushback with that. They had a time trying to get that passed through. And so they eventually got it, but they had to put Black Lives Do Matter. And so just getting those small things in Wilmington, it's been a struggle. It's been a struggle, and it goes back to what we were talking about. This is Wilmington, man, and it's a fight just to get the smallest, simplest things. But like I said, there's been people talking about trying to put some things like a Black Cultural Center here. Some of the folks I've been talking to. So there is some type of movement. But they've also been, people have been talking about doing these type of things for years as well. So hopefully we'll see. I'll try to do my best to help out, any way possible. But there is some things going on here. But again, it's Wilmington. It just takes a while to do it.
So I'm looking, you have that picture behind you of the that was where the Daily Record was, right?
Yes.
Building. So is that lot still vacant?
Yeah, it's just an empty lot. It's still there. It's still there. Yeah. And a lot of people don't even, it shocks me, man, that a lot of people still don't know what it is. But when people watch the film, I think that's another thing that the film has done too. I know it's increased tourism in Wilmington because folks watch it. They come to town, they hit me up all the time, and they go to these places. They go to the vacant lot. They go to the places that we show and talk about in the film. But one of the young men that we've been filming with on Wilmington on Fire too, a young brother by the name of Cedric Harrison. He's creating an actual black shuttle, a shuttle tour bus. It's called Wilmington in Color, and we've been documenting his process since last year, getting the bus, fixing it up. And he's going to be launching it in March, and we're going to be there for his, his first couple rides. But he's going to be taking folks who want to come to town or people that are in town to show them these landmarks and show them the different places, not only just history about 1898, but history before the massacre and after as well. And so, like I said, you got some stuff going, but you see it's mostly young folks that's saying, you know what, I want to do something. I want to stop complaining. And that's what I did. I was complaining that Hollywood wouldn't make these type of stories. And I said, you know what, let me get a camera and let me do it. And so you have a person like him, Cedric, that said, you know what, I'm gonna stop complaining and I'm gonna be a part of this solution and create a tour bus, a Black History tour bus. And so those are some of the things, man, that you're going to see real soon here in Wilmington.
That's awesome. Well, I know I speak for everyone saying that we're all grateful that you did grab a camera, because it's an amazing contribution, and I can't thank you enough. And that vacant lot would be a great place to put a new museum or some kind of a monument to the history there. So I hope someone gets on that before someone builds a fast food place or something. Well, thank you. I just want to thank you everyone for Chris and Larry and LeRae. This was a spectacular, just a wonderful discussion. It meant so much to me that you all could be a part of it. And thank you all. Thank everyone for joining. Did you have something you want to say, Larry?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought I heard someone saying. Sorry.
I just said thank you.
Oh, all right. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I've been singing solo for a long time, man. It's good not to sing solo anymore.
Anyway, thank you.
I need a chorus.
Thank you for coming. And next month, we're going to do it again. We've got a double feature next time with the James Baldwin film, I Am Not Your Negro, and the film about Toni Morrison as well. So I hope you're going to be able to join us for that. And until then, that's it. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.